This is part 2 of a talk I gave to the Jung Society of Western Australia in June 2018. A link to parts 1 and 3 are in the description below. But Jung also stood on a collective inflection point in 1913 and began to be aware of that something significant was occurring in European civilization. If the visions he were having were just personal, he would have to conclude they were the beginnings of madness. But if they proved to be connected to outer events, then the material that he was experiencing had collective significance. Here is how he tells it. Quote, "The mercy which happened to me gave me belief, hope, and sufficient daring not to resist further the spirit of the depths, but to utter his word. But before I could pull myself together to really do it, I needed a visible sign that would show me that the spirit of the depths in me was at the same time the ruler of the depths of world affairs." Close quote. The mercy he refers to is that after nearly a year of overwhelming visions and dreams, the outbreak of World War I in August 1914 relieved his fears that he was experiencing a budding schizophrenia. Here is how he describes that first vision, and I quote, "It happened in October of the year 1913, as I was leaving alone for a journey, that during the day I was suddenly overcome in broad daylight by a vision. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps, and an inner voice spoke, 'Look at it. It is completely real, and it will come to pass. You cannot doubt this.' From then on, the anxiety toward the terrible event that stood directly before us kept coming back. Once I also saw a sea of blood over the northern lands. I was in a remote English land. It was necessary that I return to my homeland with a fast ship as speedily as possible. I reached home quickly. In my homeland I found that in the middle of summer a terrible cold had fallen from space, which had turned every living thing to ice. There stood a leaf-bearing but fruitless tree, whose leaves had turned into sweet grapes full of healing juice through the working of the frost. I picked some grapes and gave them to a great waiting throng. In reality now it was so. I plucked the ripe fruit and gave it to you, and I do not know what I poured out for you, what bittersweet, intoxicating drink, which left on your tongues an aftertaste of blood." Close quote. He tried to give the healing juice to the waiting throng, to those in his own time, and also to us now, in the form of the collected works, since 2009 we realize, the Red Book. Near the end of his life in 1959, he felt he had failed when he said that he had been unable to convince people that there was a treasure buried in the field. He was referring to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verse 44. "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all that he had and bought that field." By that assertion, I think Christ and also Jung meant that there is a real and precious state of being that humans can somehow come into. Likewise, the Buddha insisted that such a state of being existed, and that it was possible to realize it. Put another way, Jung was trying to heal nothing less than the conflict between the scientific and the religious worldviews, and that the modern view, for all its advantages, left human beings isolated as individuals, cut off from the deeper parts of their natures. This modern sense of being cut off, presented at the family level in Jung's pastor father's loss of faith, all the way down to the civilizational level. He was able to let the spirit of the depths into his conscious awareness without allowing it to overwhelm him or having to reject it or set it aside in order to function in the world. Here is how he put it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I quote, "The play and counterplay between personalities number 1 and number 2, which has run through my whole life, has nothing to do with a split or disassociation in the ordinary medical sense. On the contrary, it is played out in every individual. In my life, number 2 has been of prime importance, and I've always tried to make room for anything that wanted to come to me from within. The number 2 personality is a typical figure, but is perceived only by the very few. Most people's conscious understanding is not sufficient to realize that inner figure is also what they are." Close quote. Jung saw that the material coming up from inside him was not limited to the personal, and not madness when the vision was confirmed by outer events. Here he was, a modern, scientifically trained person, having what would have been recognized as a prophetic experience in ancient times, but which fitted no recognized category of modern thinking, no legitimate epistemology, save madness. Yet he had to accept that he was somehow connected to the collective events of his time, not simply having foreknowledge of a single civilization-wide event, but a deeper understanding that included some possibility of healing the terrible split that had led to the wars of the 20th century. But because his knowledge came from a source that could not be published directly without delegitimizing himself as a scientist, he began to translate what he had learned into conceptual language. Broadly speaking, number 1 translating number 2 for an early 20th century medico-scientific audience. In his 1921 book, Psychological Types, Jung defines and locates psychology as a field of inquiry using 3 categories of being, known in philosophy as ontology, from the philosopher Kant. Esse in intellectu, esse in re, and esse in anima. That is, being in the intellect or understanding, being in the thing or object, and being in the soul or the psyche. Here is the key quote. Esse in intellectu lacks tangible reality. Esse in re lacks mind. What would the idea amount to if the psyche did not provide its living value? What would the thing be worth if the psyche withheld from it the determining force of the sense impression? What indeed is reality if it is not a reality in ourselves, an esse in anima? Living reality is the product neither of the actual objective behavior of things nor of the formulated idea exclusively, but rather of the combination of both in the living psychological process through esse in anima. We can see better today that he is trying to use philosophy to validate his own lived experience of his confrontation with the unconscious. In the absence of the Red Book, it was never completely clear how much Jung relied on and thought of the experiences he recorded as esse in anima. In a review of the Red Book, eminent German Jungian Wolfgang Giegerich expressed the opinion that it should never have been published because it was only awkward preliminary sketches, and that its publication diminished the value of Jung's conceptual theories. While I think that the publication complements and clarifies Jung's conceptual work, it does make it impossible to ignore the incompatibility between Jung's prophetic visions and the modern scientific worldview. I think Gingrich's dissent, at a minimum, points to an inevitable period of reappraisal of Jung's work that is now taking place. The case has been made since the publication of the Red Book that Jung's argument does not hold up philosophically. Robin McCoy Brooks, in her 2011 paper, Unthought Out Metaphysics in Analytical Psychology, a critique of Jung's epistemological basis for psychic reality, argues very specifically that Jung misappropriated Kant's categories. Interestingly, Gingrich is referenced twice in that paper. Brooks' key objection is that Jung's psychological essay in Anima does not function as it did in Kant's philosophy. Be that as it may, Jung wanted to demark and strengthen the difference between psychology and philosophy by avoiding metaphysical claims, that is, claims about the nature of reality. Bluntly put, Jung may well have been wrong about Kant, but essay in Anima is still a useful way of separating lived experience from the realm of ideas. Again, I quote from Jung. Only that which is psychic has direct reality. Indeed, every form of psychic activity, even the so-called unreal imaginings and thoughts which have no relation to the outside world, we call such thoughts imagination or madness, but their power is by no means destroyed thereby. Close quote. I think this is Jung's view of the difference between direct experience and what can be said to exist metaphysically or philosophically. Still, I think it is of great value to question Jung's use of Kant and other frameworks he erected to bolster his theoretical work. I won't be the first or the last to be confused by Jung's particular way of making what appears to be sweeping metaphysical assertions while carefully delimiting the scope of psychology elsewhere. Brooks, who has been helpful to me because her essay has made me more precisely aware of where I disagree with contemporary philosophy, also raises the issue of foundationalism. And I quote from Brooks, "A foundational ontology, such as Jung, Kant, and Schopenhauer embraced, is one that holds that there is a basis for knowledge, and that this basis is derived from a priori postulates. I critique the basic idea of foundationalism throughout this paper." Close quote. It may be perfectly sound to say that foundationalism is no longer sustainable philosophically from a postmodern perspective, but I would not say that is true of Jungian psychology, precisely because we as Jungians are dealing with the psychological essay in Anima, the lived inner experiences of specific human beings, with their limited lifespans and inner capacity to experience meaning, despair, hope, suffering, and all the rest that makes up lived experience. Specifically, as therapists, we deal first and foremost with the suffering of living, embodied human beings, not just with abstract objects of psychological theory, although that is necessary too. Specifically, I am making the claim that our modern attitude, as well as our philosophy and science, has a diminished awareness of direct experience and its importance. I'm not arguing against physical science and its technological products, such as my pacemaker, on which my next heartbeat is entirely dependent. I am arguing against the attempt to explain inner human experience in terms of our understanding of the outer physical world in particular. Therefore, I believe Jung's foundations are in his lived experience, which he has recorded in the Red Book and belatedly shared with us. When he said near the end of his life he had failed to convince people that there was a treasure buried in the field he was talking about was the psyche, not the intellect. That is, the empirically lived esse in anima, not the philosophic category of thought. And the treasure is the foundation. That is, the possibility for humans to find satisfactory, even transcendent meaning and purpose, with or without a belief in God. Personally, I have sought it in any and all religious traditions, taking not what appeals to me from each tradition, but insofar as I've had the courage to live it, what causes actual inner change. Either way, that possibility is the bedrock of depth psychology, the treasure Jung has bequeathed us, because it puts forward a vision of human growth that potentially leads to wholeness. Furthermore, because it does so in recognizably similar terms to those of the world's great religions, it can form a bridge by which modern secular people can reach satisfactoriness, even transcendence. Christians call the treasures they find things like amazing grace, or the experience of the living God, or even the peace that passeth all understanding. The Taoists simply say the Tao that can be spoken about is not the constant Tao. But it was the Buddha who addressed the difference between the realm of lived experience and ideas most directly when he refused to answer metaphysical questions. I'm quoting from Sutta 63 of the Pali Canon. Then, while the Venerable Malunkyaputta was alone in meditation, the following thought arose in his mind. These speculative views have been left undeclared by the Blessed One, set aside and rejected by him, namely, the world is eternal, and the world is not eternal. The world is finite, and the world is infinite. The soul is the same as the body, and the soul is one thing and the body another. The Blessed One does not declare these to me, and I do not approve of and accept the fact that he does not declare these to me. So I shall go to the Blessed One and ask him the meaning of this. And he gets his answer too. The Buddha answers, "Why have I left that undeclared? Because it is unbeneficial. It does not belong to the fundamentals of the holy life. It does not lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. That is why I have left it undeclared." And what have I declared? This is suffering, I have declared. This is the origin of suffering, I have declared. This is the cessation of suffering, I have declared. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering, I have declared. Close quote. In terms of philosophy, I think Husserl's phenomenology comes much closer than Kant's esse in anima to being a philosophy of inner human experience that could more genuinely underpin Jung's direct reality of the psyche. Ironically, Jung and Husserl were near contemporaries, and insofar as I've been able to discover, did not have any significant interaction. Nonetheless, both took as their primary focus inner human experience. Cecile Tugas writes in her The Phenomena of Awareness that both Husserl and Jung had, quote, noticed the phenomena of awareness, While Husserl called them phenomena or appearances, Jung called them images, but both terms refer to whatever is before any kind of awareness, end quote. Togus goes on to make the point that Jung complained to his English translators that the German Vorstellung includes both presentation and representation, while the English word image means representation, leaving out the sense of presentation. As a longtime reader of Jung, I notice in retrospect that the word image often seems vague. However, when I encounter Jung's use of the words primordial image, I immediately understand that more is going on than just mental images or just representations. The addition of the word primordial immediately brings to mind, at least for me, that Jung is referring to a real inner experience. Once the meaning of presentation is recovered, then the term has more power than, for example, the more conceptual synonym archetype. So I think Husserl's basic method of bracketing out our more conceptual knowledge, that is, what we know about the phenomena that are presented to us in the constant flux of living experience, and paying close attention to those phenomena, not only has the potential to underpin Jung's work philosophically, but also has led to actual therapeutic innovations. I first encountered phenomenology in therapy without recognizing it as such in a workshop on Eugene Genlin's technique of focusing, which teaches how to move awareness out of the intellect into the felt sense in the body, into not just flesh and bones, but the entire experience of awareness and connection in time and space and to other beings. More recently, I encountered an existential phenomenological approach, that is, one based in Heidegger, in a dream group led by our society's president, Britton Garrett, where we use the method of Dutch psychologist Robert Bosnak. The dream is told multiple times, shifting the listening awareness of both dreamer and listeners to deeper levels of awareness, including the reactions to the material emotionally and in the body. Bosnak says, quote, "In my understanding, phenomena, when carefully observed, exude meaningfulness, without us necessarily knowing what they particularly mean," close quote. The multiple tellings allow time for those meanings to arise and help move attention deeper without getting caught in conceptual interpretation and develop a different kind of knowing. Personally, I see this technique as another way to cultivate that way of knowing that tends to remain unacknowledged by our contemporary epistemology. I should point out at this juncture, I'm not a philosopher but a mystic, by which I mean my empirical bent is direct religious or spiritual experience, despite occasional forays into intellectual pursuits. Well, to be honest, compulsive pursuit of intellectual understanding, while sincerely believing that such endeavors are worthwhile, are insufficient for attaining wholeness or any kind of spiritual end. While I am completely serious that there is a real foundation to human existence, I put that idea forward as a practical basis for living a worthwhile life, spiritual or entirely secular, knowing my intellectual understanding of the philosophic complexities is partial and incomplete.